So welcome debaters. Congratulations on all 4 teams for making it to quarterfinals. We have annoying individuals, opening government, nothing and artificial marketing opposition, constituting the 8 and it costs too much to say here on SIGA. Before the debate starts, just a quick reminder to the audience, please do not leave the room in the middle of the speech. If you need to leave the room or go to the washroom, please do so in the middle when the speeches are finished. So having said that, without further ado, I would like to invite the Prime Minister to the head case here.
Thank you, Speaker. In terms of persuading a population that is relatively conservative, specifically, to change their views about society and to change their views about a group of people, is it better to frame this as a foreign issue that is now something a new concept that you now are forced to accept, or is it better to make this a familiar issue that is already run around you, and centrally focus around making this an issue of acceptance of your own history? I think that the latter is far more significant in creating change. That's why I proposed on opening government. 2 main arguments in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why this is better for the acceptance of these people. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why this is better for the empowerment of these people themselves, how they internalize their views, and how they better face their own identities as well. Going straight on to my first argument. Why is this better for the acceptance of these people? Because the people that we essentially need to change inside these communities are often those who are most conservative, those who are least open to these new concepts. Because oftentimes you don't need to target the moderates, nor do you need to target those who are already accepting of these LGBTQI individuals. Rather, you need to target those who are not yet accepting of these LGBTQI individuals, those who are bigoted against these individuals. Oftentimes those are the individuals who are a lot more conservative, those who are less likely or willing to change their own beliefs about society and about these individuals. What does this mean? Firstly, we think that 2 main characteristics about these people. Firstly, oftentimes these are people who are not willing to accept these people because they believe them to be unnatural, something that did not and should not exist to begin with. Oftentimes, which leads to the narrative that you are an unnatural being that is new, that is a foreign concept, that's why we're unwilling to accept you. Secondly, these people are also less prone to subscribe to Western beliefs or foreign beliefs in general, given that these people are people who believe in their own localities or conservative in their own society, who believe that society should stay the way it has been for a very long time. The idea that their own ways of living for the past many decades is significantly important to the idea that these people oftentimes hold. What is the problem here? When you frame this issue to be a foreign issue and an issue of Western terminology coming into your nation, these people see the concept of acceptance as a foreign influence and are therefore less willing to accept this. How do we change this under our side? Firstly, you make this a local historical issue, which basically fights it against the narrative that these people are unnatural beings that should not and never have existed until this point. And you have the idea that these issues are actually local issues that are historically embedded into your own culture as well. If you accept your own culture, you have to accept these people as well because the narrative under our side. Because crucially, the idea that these individuals were able to form their own culture as part of your own culture is significant in terms of explaining to these individuals that your culture, these individuals deserve to be accepted in the frame of your own culture. I'll take you in a moment. But secondly, you also don't make this a foreign influence issue, right? Because these individuals are extremely conservative to the extent that they're unwilling to accept foreign influence and they think that their own ways of living are important, then you make this an issue of their own ways of living as well, and say that this is something that was integrated into your own ways of living as well. Make it a lot easier to convince these individuals that acceptance is something that these people should be willing to subscribe to, rather than something that these people should abjectly reject because they think that this is something that's foreign, something that should not exist, that is alien to them. Sure.
When there is a long history of discrimination surrounding these words, how are you going to create a turning point on your side?
Because the difference is that obviously there's going to be a huge discrimination on either side, right? Even if you bring in new terminology, there's going to be significant discrimination against that. We say that's going to be even worse at the point at which these individuals are less willing to accept that because they see that as something foreign. They make it something that's a lot more familiar to these individuals, and the comparative we're a lot better off under our side. With that being said, second argument, why is this better for the empowerment of these people as well? Firstly, the idea that there exists a community of people around you that are historically of that sexuality is important for the empowerment of you as an LGBTQIA individual as well. Because oftentimes these individuals are afraid to face their own sexuality, are afraid to face their own communities, right? Firstly, because there's oftentimes there are often these huge doubts about your own sexuality when you're identifying yourself as an LGBTQI individual, when you're trying to figure out who you're attracted to and whatnot, right? And the idea and the norm around your society is that this is something that's extremely unnatural, that has not existed within our society for decades long. The idea that you're starting to discover your sexuality and discover that you're actually attracted to, for example, a man. The idea, this concept itself becomes extremely detrimental for you when you see when you start to identify yourself as an unnatural being. Secondly, you're also less able to open up and live as your own identity in these communities. And, the perception is that everyone around you will also see you as alien. You are able to open up to these individuals and say that you are also of an LGBTQI individual. How do you better deal with this under our side? And you emphasize the existence of these people and the existence of these communities historically inside your own nation as well. This leads to situations where, number one, you're able to accept the idea that these individuals did exist historically within your own community, and therefore it's not necessarily something that's unnatural even within your own nation and your own localities. But secondly, and more importantly, you're also able to identify the fact that there's a community around you that's willing to help out and reach out to you. And you have the idea that there exist communities within your own locality that you can subscribe to and be part of, right? Now, this is significant in terms of you recognizing your own identity and being able to open up to your own sexuality. That this is important for these individuals in self-actualization for them. Secondly, you also allow these individuals to better form a sense of community inside their own localities. Because oftentimes when you force these individuals to turn to something that's foreign or to something that's to find some pride inside their own identities, it's difficult for these individuals to actually relate to those issues and therefore relate to something, the issue of the idea of pride in their own identities. I mean, how the idea that there's a historically, culturally rich community inside your own locality that you can subscribe to, it better allows you to form a sense of pride in your own identity and in your own sexuality. And this is important for these individuals' self-actualization. Anything provoking? Alright, go.
I think your premise is that there is an alternative, every alternative notion that counters LGBTQ, but how could you say that there are transgender notion when there is inside those norms?
Number one, that is in the info slide. Number two, in nations that does not exist, we think that it's still better to turn to localities or relatively more local issues, right? You think that that's a lot better. You think that that's just the assumption of this debate. Thirdly, this allows people who are raised in conservative backgrounds and who uphold these own values themselves, uphold confucianist values themselves to also to identify themselves as these individuals. Because oftentimes these individuals don't simply have LGBTQIA as their own one single identity. Oftentimes they also have Confucianist values as part of their identity as well. And oftentimes when those two values collide, it's difficult for them to reconcile those beliefs and reconcile those values and therefore identify as their own selves and therefore self-actualize based on that. And then when you get into these individuals are alternative where these two different values and these two different identities can coexist and can be reconciled. You allow these individuals to better self-actualize themselves and to better accept their own identities, their own individual aspects, rather than to shame and hate and fall into a trap of self-hate that oftentimes exists when you cannot accept your own identity. For all these reasons, because we better allow for acceptance of these individuals from society, but also better acceptance of these individuals from their own selves, we're very proud to propose. Thanks.
When it comes to local history and local community, they suddenly sort of assert and they suddenly presume that these conservative people will now suddenly be interested, in an issue like LGBTQ communities, and they'll suddenly support these communities just because it's a local issue. We don't think that that's necessarily the case, right? When it comes to the conservative people, as OG draws, as the PM draws, we think that the distinction between a foreign and a local issue is very, very small and very minimal. Because at least when these LGBTQ communities do advertise their movement and do try to gain support and do try to spark up an interest, we do think that the very core of this the very core would still be about the LGBTQ and the oppression that they face, rather than it's a local issue, it's a local history. So we don't think that these conservative people will suddenly now buy into that movement and suddenly support this movement. We think that the very premise should have been provided by the movement, right? And then they talk about empowerment and how these people will be like, will be able to more naturally accept their like sexuality, and also they talk about like how like they'll, since they're afraid to like face their community, it will be now better. Right? We think that the problem is that these communities are already existing in the status quo, but the problem is that they're very stigmatized and they're not viewed as positively. So under their scenario, they kind of presume that suddenly these like because these communities are so viewed positively, that these people will be able to internalize their sexuality better, right? We think that that's not necessarily the case. Rather, because these communities are very like, or because these people like are stigmatized, and like if because in that local history as well, we think that rather these people will not be able to like empower themselves as OG draws. So now we want to talk about what OGO wants to provide to you is first we want to talk about the necessity of Western terminology and how it's more effective for that social movement to accept Western terminology. So then let's go, before you go.
If you accept the idea that these individuals were stigmatized and these communities were stigmatized, how do you sort of, on your side, neglect these communities and focus on Western terminology?
Yeah, that's what we're going to provide to you, right? That's why we want to talk about why we should further like accept Western terminology when it comes to LGBTQ movements, right? First, we want to talk about like the certain characteristics of how Western terminology looks like, and why that's more beneficial for these movements to take in those terminologies, right? First, let's talk about how these movements are very concise. So when it comes to like these like Western like LGBTQ movements, we think that they tend to crystallize their message in very simple sentences, and that they spread and use. So basically, they don't really like talk about these long histories of how their civil movements have started, but rather they focus, especially in the 21st century, they focus on the simple messages that they spread throughout like like SNS and like in their LGBTQ festivals and so on, right? We think that, for example, like songs like Born This Way or like the hashtag Pride itself is the concise message that they use in this Western like terminology itself. Not only that, we think that the second characteristic is that they tend to brand themselves, right? We think that they brand their we are going to talk about like they tend to brand their movements such as like the rainbow flags, the rainbow emojis, and so on. We think that they do gain recognition and they are more noticed. They go more noticed from these kind of branding themselves. Not only that, we think that the barriers become lower to take in that movement itself, right? We think that that's what's happening because it's more like as an individual in a gray area, we think that it's more easy for you to use the hashtag Pride and just pass on like a LGBTQ festival than actively looking into the local history of the communities that exist, right? We think that when it comes to these barriers and these individuals actually stepping in to take an interest, we think that branded the consumerisms and also the songs, for example, we think that these kind of branding methods that these movements use are much more effective when it comes to getting recognition. So why is this important, right? We think that because when it comes to social movements, it's inherently a number game. We think that every civil rights movement is basically about this. It's not just basically about how much quality movement you actually provide and the social message that you spread, but it's also about getting the supporters. It's also about being noticed, and it's also about spreading. It's also about letting people know that you have been oppressed. So basically, we're telling you that it's important to take in these, it's necessary to take in these Western terminologies because it's more effective in not just getting numbers, but also sparking an interest, right? So it's also about being noticed. Because we tell you that when it comes to these local, because compared to these local history, we think that you as in if you're not really an LGBTQ or in an active human rights activist, we think that you're not really incentivized or you're not going to be interested to look up at the long history that exists, or look up at how these movements have continued and how these communities exist in these diverse ways or so on, right? We think that these interests won't really be sparked up on their side, right? We think that in when it comes to these social movements and you wanting to get a certain recognition, we think that these Western terms are going to be much more effective. Because if you're just in the gray area, you're more likely to be interested in pride hashtags or rainbow flags than these long local histories that their movement is going to provide. But before you go on, yes.
Can't local terminology supposed to be simple and simple? Aren't they more likely to be words acceptable and that they're more familiar?
We think that it's about the recognition that already exists, right? We think that when it comes to pride movements, we think that the history, also when it comes to as you emphasize, when it comes to history and the impact that they already have in the status quo is going to be a lot bigger than what you guys are going to try, right? And not only that, we think that when it comes to these local communities also trying to brand themselves, we think that they're also going to follow follow the path of these Western terminologies that are going to exist anyway, right? We think that when it comes to like you trying to come up with new methods to buy more people and to get more supporters, you're obviously going to like, when it comes to like already movements existing and these like rainbow flags already like so prevalent in this in like SNS and so on, we think that you're more likely to follow these kind of paths anyway. We think that it's going to be much more effective when it comes to like you trying to get more recognition and not only that you're trying to get more supporters, right? And we also want to talk about like how about like these conservative people, why it's better to like, why like the distinction between like a foreign issue and a local issue will be very minimal, right? We tell you that because when it comes to like social movements, we think that like it's not really the importance itself is not about like you differentiating this as a local issue and a foreign issue, right? We think that the core of this movement should be the LGBT movement for even in like these countries. We think that at the end of the day, the goal of this like movement itself is to be accepted as not just a local like person that's living in that community, so I have to be accepted, but just to like spread the message that because I'm an LGBT, I should also be accepted as like as basic human rights. Right? We think that because this message is more like should still not lose its focus. We think that we do need a Western terminology, and for you to be very proud of
We think that when we talk about movements in general, we have to think about what's the most strategic way to actually make sure that the movement spreads, right? However, we're talking about very specific contexts like China or other conservative Asian countries, which are not so open to Western values, right? That's why we think that when it comes to these kinds of countries, we have to target the whole LGBT movement in a very different way, to localize the whole movement, to make sure that the local community can actually empathize with the experiences of the LGBT community that their locals are going through. That's why coming from side government, we are very clear in the stance that we want LGBT movements to be highly localized, and we think that the best way to do that is to use local terminologies that are very close and that are very familiar to the local public. But before I move on to my argument, where I'm going to talk about how, so in one speech he proved to you how it's much better off in the domestic scale when we use local terminology, I'm going to be talking about how in the global movement of LGBT community as a whole, it is much better off under our side. Before that, let me have one point of clarification that and the rebuttals will be integrated in my argumentation. Now, a while ago in one minute speech, there was a very funny POI about how local terminology has negative taboo, therefore it won't work. We think that while we do agree that maybe the present moment, even these local terminologies may be negative in nature. However, if you think about it, even in Western countries, terminologies like feminism or LGBT used to have an extremely taboo nature. However, because it was familiar and because there was a lot of discourse revolving these kinds of terminologies, people were able to grow their empathy regarding these people, and actually this has sparked the whole movement in and of itself. But even if, let's say, that terminology is so harmful, we think that it's even better off under our side, right? Because we're talking about contexts like Singapore and whatnot, where they created the ASEAN Human Rights Council just to counter Western values, because there are a lot of anti-Western progressive sentiments, right? When we target these kinds of countries, we think that it's very important to make sure that they know that the movements of the LGBT is something that's very close to home and something that not Western people are pushing for. That's why we think that at the end of the day, we are better off under our side. But let's talk about my argument, where I'm going to prove to you why it's much more beneficial under our side when we talk about the whole global scale movement of the LGBT community. There was an argument coming from the leader of opposition who told us that Western terminology is very important because they're very concise in nature and that it has a wonderful branding like #BornThisWay or #Pride. They never proved to us, though, that there was no logical link as to how these Western movements will actually work in these kinds of Asian countries when in the past it has failed, right? That's because Asian countries, their first language is in English. They don't understand, a lot of them even don't understand what #BornThisWay even means, because this is something that's very close to people who are very exposed to the Western culture, right? However, we're talking about communities which may even not be exposed to these kinds of cultures. Therefore, they never even proved to us how it will actually
work under their side, right? But secondly, we think that the whole concise movement and concise branding is something that's not mutually exclusive to their side. If that's a problem that they think that we think that it's easily solvable by using local terminologies to make it more concise and more attractive to the local community without having to use very specific wording that only whitewashed people understand. Therefore, we think that what they do under their side is that they simply dismiss the different nuances of the LGBT community within these Asian countries. That's why, if we talk about the context, let's understand what Asian communities are going through. We think that LGBT members of different countries go through different experiences, right? For example, an LGBT in Switzerland, where democracy is very much widespread, but LGBT marriage is not legalized. Or, for example, LGBT community in America, where marriage was legalized, but there's still a lot of taboo going around the community. Or even LGBT community in Saudi Arabia, where it's just taboo in nature. All these kinds of different people living in different countries have very specific nuances to their experiences that are very much incomparable to other LGBT communities in different parts of the world. And because of these different nuances, we think that what it means to be gay or what it means to be an LGBT community in different parts of the world is something that's very unique in nature, and it's very different when it comes to different kind of things. That's why even when it comes to feminism, the whole white feminism propaganda was very much condemned, simply because what it did was that it dismissed the intersectionality of the different experiences and the different nuances of the whole feminist movement, right? Therefore, what we're saying simply under side government is that we need to respect the importance of respecting these kinds of different nuances and different experiences, and therefore respecting the whole nature of intersectionality when it comes to the experiences of the LGBT community, right?
Yeah.
So what we want to achieve under side government is very simple. We think that intersectionality is best respected especially when we take into consideration of this historical significance that captures the core experiences that the LGBT movement in a specific country is going through. And we think that the best way to do this is through using local terminologies, like for example, Jatil of Indonesia or Maje of Singapore. That's why when we're saying that we want to forward these kinds of global agendas of the LGBT community in a whole international community, we think that a lot of times what happens in status quo is that when it comes to discourse, right, it's very much easy to simply group the whole LGBT community as a whole, when different experiences are something that's very important to consider.
Yeah.
But what we're doing under side government is that we're considering these different kinds of nuances, and that's why the impact that we have is that when we're having discourse in the international community to forward LGBT rights, we're much better off simply because we consider what the very specific nuances. That's why we're saying that under side government, we're better off at the end of the day as a comparative to side opposition, because what they simply do is that they think that one solution, one size fits all policy, which is basically insignificant, especially to countries which are very much against the whole Western concept of what it means to be gay. But rather, what we do is that we target from the very core. We target from domestic scale, where we consider how we will actually expand the LGBT movement in the local scale, and even how to make sure that the local LGBT community has a community to look forward to, simply because they know that they have historical meaning that they could look forward to. But even in a global scale, now the different, very specific experiences is something that will be put on the table when the international community is talking about how to forward the agenda as a whole. Therefore, for all these reasons, we think that Thai government takes this debate. Thank you.
terminology, these acts as a trend. They already have recognition. They already have various impacts in the status quo. But if we focus too much on locality, what we're trying to tell you is that it actually diversifies the LGBTQ movements in general. But furthermore, the collective efforts is not going to happen to begin with. So basically, the Deputy Prime Minister came up to the podium and mainly talked about how intersectionality or different nuances is an important issue. The thing is this, they characterize these nations as a conservative state to begin with. That's the very problem why we need to use a terminology which has recognition and already have a lot of impact in the society. This is because it's not a time to prioritize intersectionality in those regions. So it's actually much more important to spark up the agendas in those nations to begin with. That's how feminist movements or minority movements that they have constantly talked about started with. They prioritize certain issues first before moving on to other specific issues of each minorities. And this is because, especially in those regions, it's important to collectivize these efforts in order to push an agenda which was already existent in other parts of the world. And also, pushing all sorts of different nuances is not going to work in such conservative nations because they're conservative to begin with to accept these LGBTQ ideas, but then suddenly you're pushing for these small, specific, nuanced ideas. It's going to be actually much more difficult. Furthermore, they also talked about how these individuals through these localized terminology is going to identify themselves, and it's better for their beneficial for the identity of these LGBTQ movements. The thing is this: the local culture regarding LGBTQ is so these. They talk about how it's beneficial to their own identity. The thing is this: we tell you that identifying with their own identity is better with Western terminology. The reason is this: because there has been a lot of foreign campaigns and foreign successes in other issues. So in that sense, they could actually internalize these successes better through using Western terminologies. Because when they use localized terms, they already have a taboo in the general society. In that sense, if we use these localized terms, it's actually going to much more harm their identity, and that's because there has been existing stigma. Yes.
If the comparative is that there is a taboo on our side, who tells us there's no taboo on your side?
Okay, I'm going to do that later on. So moving on to my constructive. So furthermore, they also talked about the idea of how it's much more easier for the general society to identify with the LGBTQ movement. The thing is this: the local culture regarding those regions, the LGBTQ is already sort of to an extent used as a cultural cultural means or popular tourism product. But then even with such aspects, they have been constantly stigmatized. Even they have used these kind of localized terms. So I'm going to tell you in my constructives how these embedded stigmatization exists in these terminologies, and how these Western terminologies is going to fresh up these LGBTQ movements. And secondly, I'm going to talk about how international cooperation is necessary and how it's going to happen and be beneficial towards the LGBTQ movements in these regions. So firstly, regarding the idea of stigma. So LGBTQ has been prominent in those regions for a long history, but that has not been effective until now. And these terminologies that they have used was used as a way to stigmatize other people by the conservative sector in those societies. And because of that stigma, it's difficult to get acceptance of the rest of the society because they relate these terminologies as a negative thing to begin with. However, so in that sense, it's necessary that LGBTQ movements in those regions, new ideas, new terminologies, to freshen up the viewpoints of the society. So what happens on the comparative on our model, compared to the negative stigmas prominent regarding the localized terminologies? The thing is this: when it comes to Western terminologies, which is prominent or which gets a lot of issues in the journal issues. It's mostly so for example on social media or whatnot, they mostly picture or depict these issues in a positive in a positive light using these Western terminologies. Furthermore, these kind of they actively portray these issues in a positive light compared to the localized terminology. In that sense, we tell you that this is yeah. And furthermore, regarding also the idea of international cooperation. So we tell you that international cooperation is also important in the sense that if you want to push more agendas in these conservative societies, it's important that you bring in issues of the international society and how it worked in the more progressive societies to begin with. It's important to bring foreign cases, telling the conservative society how in the foreign cases it was a really common issue dealt in the society in their society. For example, like so also like these kind of foreign ideas was effective in for example like human rights issues such as like child labor or whatnot. So in that sense, we tell you that bringing foreign ideas was beneficial to there has been acceptance in the status quo like historically. But secondly, we tell you that we tell you that these cooperation is going to be much more easily happen because there's as my leader of opposition told you, they use like science terms. They use this as trends which is like popular, and they actually get more exposure because they use concise like terminologies. Why they also talked about how concise terminologies can happen under their model. What we tell you is that since these concise terminologies has been constantly used in other parts of the society, it actually brings in more positive cases for these LGBTQ movements to make progress in their society. So because these terminologies can bring more cases and make a new light towards these LGBTQ movements in such conservative societies, we're proud to oppose.
Now I would like to invite the member of the board to start closing the hearing.
Panel, I think the issue with Top Half is that they try to claim a lot of large impacts excessively obsessed about changing societal attitudes, without realising that fundamentally norms and power structures and whatnot still persist in society, where the LGBT movement largely has very limited political capital, and therefore it's not likely to be a debate about swaying how mass attitudes operate, because as noted by OO, it's probably true that people would still see LGBT as a Western issue externally to the community anyway. It's unclear how any of Top Half's impacts would necessarily materialise. I'm going to give you three things in my speech today. First, I'm going to talk about why exactly using Western language reinforces colonialist and racist stereotypes and also bigotry that causes problematic interactions within communities. Secondly, I'm going to talk about intranslatability of historical experiences and why you deny the ability for queer individuals in these countries to relate their own experiences. And finally, I'm going to talk about how this affects engagement between poor and impoverished queers who can't speak English and engage in English with the movement itself. First though, let's talk about the entire O as a whole. The majority of O's cases, basically Western language and lingo, is better for two reasons. One, because you refer to it, and two, because it's more concise. My overarching observation here is to know that there are already a lot of existing terminology that exists within these communities. And the pushback to this is to say, but there's stigma. Here's the thing, to the extent there's stigma on both sides, right? We think the stigma exists on both sides because of the cultural rejection of these beliefs. We think the stigma is worse on your side for two additional and more important reasons than OG. One, is because you're denying access to this concept of queerness to those individuals who can't afford expensive education, who can't afford social status, who can't afford meeting foreign friends to learn English and paying for tuition classes, that you're denying them the ability to engage and grapple with queerness. That's why it's so much worse. But secondly, it's because of the cognitive barrier required for you to process information like non-binary and intersex, but in Chinese, a far more simple language of 中性人 would do. That is why fundamentally it's so much harder for you to relate to this framework. These are new reasons, not an OG. But secondly, I'm going to take them at best. I want to prove to you why you get more new local terminology created with reference to local history. Why is this viable? 3 reasons. 1, because in many cases, language and linguistic meanings and references, like born this way and whatnot, are constructed through interactions within communities. Once you reach a critical mass of individuals within a society, that is when you can create new meanings and create new words or references that allow you to understand and celebrate your own history and past. Secondly, because it's very easy to borrow and parallelize language, CF in Chinese, the way to refer to homosexual individuals is you say 同志. 同志 also means comrade, and this co-optation only happened in the late 1990s because they were easily able to borrow existing frameworks and references and say, look, I'm going to borrow a neutral term right now and use it to denote homosexuality. That is how you circumvent all the taboo stuff coming from O. Third of all, reclamation only happens when you have the movement there to resolve the collective action problem. Of course, you can't reclaim meanings when you have 1 or 2 people using fag as a fundamentally nice word of reclamation. But when you have a community or a movement doing it, that is when you can reclaim words and create new local terminology. That is why O's claim doesn't work. Because note, all of the impacts of engagement in the international community there, it neglects the fact that the majority of those people who speak English and understand English belong to liberal, progressive groups in societies, which means that these are not the people that you want to target anyway. That is why O is out of this debate. Let's then talk about problematic interactions. Key premise 1. We think the way language is constructed in English reflects underlying racism, power asymmetries, and relations. Why? 3 reasons. 1, the justificatory need to use language to justify your biases and bigotry. That is why in many cases, in the UK or in English in general, we use whitewashing to denote the usage of language to purify something, right? Because white connotes innocence, white connotes goodness, whereas black, in contrast against that, connotes evil and whatnot. There's an implicit justificatory nature in the way language is shaped. Secondly, because you often relate language and create new terms from your own angle and point of view, right? The point of view of a white man within a colonial structure is fundamentally different from a Hong Konger who suffered under the oppression of a colonial system, who suffered under colonialism because it didn't bring them the good that the white Rudyard Kipling thought they brought to Hong Kong. But thirdly, because those people with the most privilege and dominance within the creation of language tend to be those with the most privilege, who have access to the clergy, the church, the banks, the schools, and all of these individuals that don't have the lived experiences of those who are suffering under colonialism of Western cultures. Part 2 to this claim. This is why you get problematic interactions. First impact is fetishization of Westernness, right? The example I'll use here is when you think about the words twink or beer, you often have a Caucasian male coming to mind. For instance, when you talk about twinkness, it's the idea of a Caucasian male, pure, skinny, and fetishized for the alleged innocence, or a beer for its alleged strength. But never once in this imaginary or in this controlling image do you actually think of a black man or an Asian man, because in many cases there's a desexualization of men. We see this in Crazy Rich Asians, where there's a fundamental desexualization of Asians through the usage of language that fetishizes the white purity, white innocence, and whatnot. This is bad because it means if I am someone living in these countries and I'm queer myself, I don't believe that I'm genuinely queer, or even if I do, I don't believe that I belong to the good queer or the best queer group. That causes internalized problematic narratives that are fundamentally bad because it affects everyone within these countries. Secondly, you also cause segregation. The example we use here is that when you talk about Western immigrants, you often use the word expat. But when you talk about people moving from Southeast Asia to China and whatnot, you use the word immigrant. Why is that the case? Because expat versus immigrant is precisely an example of linguistic dichotomization, where you segment communities into different groups. That is how you bar local communities from interacting or engaging with international communities, because they always see themselves as, to borrow in the case of Thailand, if you're an intersex, you're called a ladyboy, versus a non-binary individual in the West. You can never relate because you see yourself as a ladyboy with the intersex community, the non-binary community overseas. That's where you don't get more intersectionality or collaboration there. Third impact, understanding history. Note, in many cases, whether intentionally or subconscious or not, language is often used by Western colonialists to justify their own actions. That is why there's never a proper word for genocide or queerphobic persecution of Spanish indigenous people within the Americans, right? Because there's no word for it in the understanding of English. That is why the only way to generate colonial oppression of queer people under Catholic norms and whatnot. It's for you to say, look, I'm going to use my own language and own terms to talk about this experience. That is how you point to historical genocide, historical injustice, and say, I want justice, I want reclamation, I want compensation for that. You don't have that when your community doesn't allow you to utilize language there. Fourth impact, engagement with a movement. If I don't have the resources to access English, the only way I'm going to engage in movement is when I can actually understand what the fuck they're talking about. That's only going to happen when fundamentally you have the language and common frames of references allow you to unlock and tap into disadvantage, the poor, those without status, those without the ability to tap into English. And these are the people that are most vulnerable in this debate. For all of these reasons, I'm so proud to oppose today. Thank you.
I think all the other teams has just tried to make a dichotomy between the West and these local communities or these local languages. But the point is how language is being understood by these people and the narrative surrounding these languages and how it affects the individuals and society. Because language doesn't exist in a vacuum. It tells lots of narratives and lots of culture and lots of traditions of like discrimination or either like battling with the discrimination. And we're going to analyze that deeper on our extension. But before moving on to my extension, a couple of engagement to closing government. They told us that this is a kind of fetishization of like English or Western culture. Like that was a too broad or like general analysis, as to say they just pick up the very few individuals who are like racist and they're going to rank themselves like West are like superior to like these people, which like exists anyway, like different from this like topic. But and also they kind of talk about the historical like injustices created by West and people are going to hate that. But when you look at it, like Western music, Western clothes, Western companies, Western services, people in these countries are enjoying all of these kind of things. So theoretically, it might be true that West has colonized them and create injustices. But realistically, people are feeling okay with like interacting with Western culture and actually casually engaging with those new ideas. So thank you. And the other thing that closing government told us was that this is like very difficult for poor or some individual who don't really have access to English or like those kind of things. Like, we're not saying that you should discuss in English when you're talking about these kinds of issues. We're just saying that you should pick up some like new and important words to re-level the face of your community and share the refreshed understanding. And I don't think that's that like difficult. When the closing government also said that they want to create new words in their local terms, I think that's not much different. So, moving on to extension, I'm going to talk to you two kinds of things. First, I'm going to tell you the historical implication of these local languages, and secondly, I'm going to tell you how does this Western terminology encourage sexual minority to be proud of their identity and to further extent to create a social improvement. No, thank you. So let's look at the historical implications of these words. Because opening government told that like being familiar with this language will make people like acceptable. But we're going to prove to you like being familiar means that it's lots more difficult to be accepted. Because the local language don't exist in a vacuum, as I told you. Throughout their like long history of usage, they entail lots of stereotypical narratives and attitudes surrounding sexual minorities. For example, lots of times they are used as a language of contempt or bullying, or lots of times these languages are used for jokes. Lots of times, like they are used for like there are like famous tellings that multisexual minority using these words. We think that these kinds of traditions are surrounding these kinds of language, and when you use those kinds of terminology, what comes in people's mind is all of these kinds of culture. No, thank you. So the language is the very basis that creates the norms in your mind and the glasses through which you're going to view the world. So what is the implication of this? What is the implication of continuing labeling themselves with these local terminology? Firstly, on the societal level, like people would just perceive them as just another joke, because it is easy to casually joke, because the norm created in surrounding that language is that in that way, and it is difficult to doubt it's violating those equity. And thank you. For example, even a politician or like famous people would like use these kinds of language to discriminate in a discriminatory way, and people would doubt that because that's a tradition and that's a culture surrounding that specific language. But more importantly, on the individual level, we think that it is highly difficult for them to commit to those community or like label themselves with these like languages, or even to come out, because they know that if they use these kinds of terminology, it's going to only spark laughter of other people. They're just going to be joke, or they're just going to be laugh or make fun of other people. So we think that these kinds of all those narratives and attitudes like created through these languages and tell these languages is very, very difficult to be excluded, and that's why we think that is never productive to continue using these kinds of terminology. Closing.
Look, this historical connotation thing is a wash, because on your side you also have connotations of hundreds of years of colonialism, imperialism, and conquest and whatnot. Is it better to be seen as a joke, or to be seen as an accomplice in colonialism and foreign imperialism? Please compare between those two.
Yeah, to compare it, I just told you that people don't feel that like Western colonialism, like kind of historic narrative, and all of these languages, but more importantly, comparatively, when you specifically focus on this like sexual minority issue, like people are directly going to feel these like local terms as something that should be used in jokes, and compared to that, when you use that in Western language, people might feel unfamiliar with it, but it doesn't really create jokes at that point. So moving on to my second extension, no thank you. So how does these Western like terminology encourage sexual minority to be proud of their identity? So firstly, on the individual level, the kind of like notion that LGBTQ terminology entail is that it is a language of like requiring the reduction of discrimination, or it's the language to fight against attacks, or it is something that relates to change, and it's not a language that is being used just a joke by other people surrounding in that local area. So you feel much more encouraged, or at least feel more hope to clinch on that word and to subscribe to that word. And they, closing government, like told that they can just invent new words with using like local terms. Like in order for words to be used by people, it needs to be a cultural background, or it should be like it needs a widespread sharing of language. So it's so very, very difficult to like invent those kinds of new words, or at least to be shared by widespread of people. And we think that it's much, much more easier for like widespread of individual to like to know these kinds of like Western terminology, where it is like as widespread on internet, SNS. I think it's much, much easier to subscribe to for those individuals and to be encouraged to. But secondly, onto the societal level, the very people like we are targeting to, as the government bench was telling you, was that those who are like casually hating sexual minority, or those who are just not interested in dealing with sexual minority. Like they feel justified to make jokes, discrimination towards them with their familiar words, but compared to that, like using these Western language, it's harder for them to make jokes, or it's harder for them to use as a language of discrimination, because they know the like story in the West through like things like SNS or like discourse, that like these are the kinds of words that are like tackling with discrimination and tackling to like deal with social injustices. And also we tell you that it sparks discussion towards people, because opening opposition told you the familiar word is good, but like familiar doesn't mean that they are familiar with how problematic that like social issue is. These kinds of like Western terminology like directly entails these kinds of like social background of like fighting with social injustices, and we tell you it is like we can spark discussion on that level, and that's why we are proud to oppose. Thank you very much.
word called han, which is an emotion of deep sadness, but also mixed with shame, with regret, and a small amount of implicit anger. It's a word that was created and gained meaning from a society that was long oppressed, both by themselves and the hierarchies we created in our country, but also by foreign invaders who oppressed and colonized the country as well. It's a word that is untranslatable because the emotions that gave it meaning are uniquely different and created from a uniquely constraint of historical context that is different from any English word that can attempt to translate the same thing. That's why language is intrinsically important, because the historical context in which such words were made lends meaning to it that is different, because that context, and it's important, because that historical context is still applicable in these countries today. The context of things like colonialism, the social hierarchies that plague many Asian nations, they give this emotic feeling behind language, is very relevant in the societies we live in today. That's why Brian told you from their extension why it is important for us to use our local language, because it gives individuals the ability to access their own identity through unique meaning that is important uniquely to the societies that have created that language in the first place, that is entirely disassociated with the Western language in itself. What am I going to talk about today? First, I'm going to respond to CEO, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about why words are important and why opening loses out on this thing. What does CEO respond to us by? Notice how CEO never really responds to Brian's argument about how these words are important for individuals to be able to access their own cultural values or their cultural historical context in which they identify themselves as members of the LGBT community. But secondly, the things that they do respond to, and they respond to two things. Firstly, about how fetishization of English doesn't happen and how poor people can still access. When it comes to fetishization of English, I think what they're saying is just false. Why? Because the movement relies on these terms, because the movement relies on the historical context of Western LGBT successes, as OWO tries to claim. If this is the case, then obviously intrinsically any movement created in local communities must also rely and heavily try to favor the English terms and the colonial context in which these norms were built upon. What does that mean? That means that some countries that were colonized or oppressed in the past have two problems. Firstly, that's hard for society to accept, which is what OG tried to claim. But secondly, that it is an oppression of self as well. That in order to claim your own identity, you're forced to resort to the colonial terms. You're forced to resort to English, which was exactly the country that had created oppression in the first place. That maybe it's not like colonialism didn't create oppression of like LGBT values, but already there was oppression in society created in that sense, and you're just increasing that onto yourself. But secondly, when they talk about poor people as well, I think it's still the same context, that if you are poor, you still want to engage with the movement. That means you have to learn these English terms, and you have to be knowledgeable about these English ideas, which is, again, the same harm that we've been pointing out. But what do they say in their extension instead? Firstly, they say there's lots of stereotypes that are associated with these words. Why is this not important? Firstly, because we told you that many positive words exist already in the status quo. And even if you're talking about stereotypical context, the fact that because these words weren't used recently, instead we are using westernized words, means that the very stereotypes that they say are embedded in the word LGBT probably is less apparent on the historical words that we're trying to use in our own culture. So I think they're just beating themselves by saying that these words have negative connotation. That is probably the very words that you are trying to use. But secondly, we said that even if this is uniquely true, that it's possible to reclaim words. It's possible to create new words based on the context of history, because obviously all countries have some history of LGBT communities. If it's not as prominent as other countries, that history still exists. What we are proposing on our side is to tap into it and try to access it so it's more accessible for people on the ground. But finally, this is a flip argument to the POI we gave them. I don't think they gave a Korean response. The idea that already these are colonialistic words, that it's not just oppression in that you have to adhere to colonialism. The response was to say, well, some countries are okay with colonialism, but like Singapore, Hong Kong, India, Mexico, Ghana, South Africa, I think many countries are still very traumatized by what colonialism did. So opposition as a whole seems to contextualize this as a very Anglo-friendly world, in which case if you use English, people are okay with your ideas. I don't think this is true. They're probably debating on a very small part. Finally, they say that these words, because they are familiar, it is much harder to make jokes about it. Two responses here. Firstly, I think we already pointed out that this isn't about jokes, that this will probably create more anger if you're using English words, directly with because English words are associated with
colonial past. But secondly, like these jokes probably exist anyway. The anger towards LGBT communities, as Brian uniquely told you, that is inherent in society, makes it hard for these kind of political changes that they're trying to claim to happen. I don't think they're essentially just trying to prove anything very impactful. So why are words important? I think the argument from all teams that's agreement is that terminology is important. The premise from opening, the promise from opening is kind of unrealistically big things, refusing to engage in the realistic context. What do I mean by this? O piggybacks on the idea of recognition. They promote the idea that if you use American words, like the local people will like it because it's US and therefore they will support like policies to change and have more critical mass. They give two benefits. One, that it's accessible, and two, that it co-opts existing successes. Why is it not accessible? I think they fail to understand that this is just not true in status quo. If what they're saying is true in status quo, then there would already be vast political movements that are clearly not existing. I think their benefits are minimal at best. They have not even mechanized how they're going to reach this. But secondly, it's only for unique groups that can access these words. We told you that accessibility has no meaning. If the poor people or the people who have less access to English, history, and culture cannot access it, then these words are less important and therefore unaccessible to these movements. But finally, on the idea you want to co-opt existing successes, we told you that why can't you describe using your own terminology or just using case studies if you absolutely want to talk about Western cases? Well, we told you that even if you can't use Western case studies, we uniquely told you why this is important. Because you're more able as an individual to access your own history and to understand your own emotions in a way that is more important to yourself. OG tries to tell us that perception and de-Westernization is important because if you use traditional language, the conservative people will like, and there will be mass changes in legislation. I think we need to be realistic and engage with the worst case that opposition presents us, which is where structural changes are hard to imagine. In that situation, what are we promising from closing our government? We beat up both operating teams because they failed to recognize the goal of LGBT. The teams here are promising that they can reach critical mass, but critical mass is merely a tool in trying to achieve more ability for people to self-actualize and to present themselves in the manner they find most important to themselves. We reject that their arguments that they lead to critical mass have any meaning if they're unable to gain accessibility for the people who are in most need of it. That's why we're very proud of closing government. Thank you.
Obviously, this is a central question which underlies this debate is a language or the perception of the people. How people is going to react to language or terminology that they have. And we think at the end of the day, the characterization of the languages, of Western languages about LGBTQ issue is a little bit unrealistic. Because we think at the end of the day, the reasonable conclusion that we have to have is that because this local terminology is already contaminated or tainted by historical discrimination or historical or cultural discrimination or by these local elders. We think this term itself is associated with the traumatic experiences or these kind of memories, and it's going to be much harder to be painted like a principle or the ideology of this individual and globalized movement. And of course, this kind of English might be associated with the colonialism or this kind of, but we think comparatively we have to prioritize the forward way. Therefore, we will really plan to oppose this motion. I'm going to qualify this debate from two perspectives. No, thank you. From two perspectives. First, I'm going to examine the acceptance of this kind of individual. This is mainly engagement with the opening government. And secondly, I'm going to deeply analyze the language issue, which is coming from the closing government. Now I'm going to engage this part in this section. Okay, first issue. Let's take the logic coming from the opening government. No, thank you. The main logic coming from the opening government is a first this kind of ideology and this kind of words is only not here. It seems to be alien, and so local people would much easier to refute these kind of ideas. But the point here here is that we think there is no positive difference even in their self-house, because the principle of LGBTQ idea itself, or the principle of every single people have the equal itself, is the idea from the Western ideology. And even if these kind of people use local languages or this kind of thing, people think this idea itself is a Western idea. This idea itself seems to be alien, seems to be like foreign ideas. There's no political difference. There's no significant difference at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, even if we take the logic coming from the opening government, they cannot make a significance at all from the very beginning. And the point which we have to recognize here is that, as I pointed out in my introduction, this kind of historical term, this kind of local term itself is painted fully, completely by the historical memories or experiences. There is kind of like articles, there is kind of books or this kind of comedies which discriminate these kind of individual in these kind of local words. These kind of people feel their discrimination. These kind of people, sexual minority experience is deeply associated with this kind of terminology from the very beginning. And compared with that, this kind of significance that opening government which bring to us is that they will be less significant at all. So at the end of the day, opening government's analysis of this kind of antipathy or the logic of the alienistic or foreign ideas is totally not applicable to this motion.
Maybe the LGBTQIA movement is always going to be seen as foreign, but at the bottom line, is it not better to at least imagine it free from colonialist, imperialist, and racist connotations than to imagine it as a construct that is both foreign and invasive and imperialist?
Let's hear that in my second section. Okay, moving on to my second section. Our language issue or argumentation coming from opposing government. First of all, we think this characterization of English itself is totally unrealistic. Yes, that's true. English itself and some words in English are deeply derived from the colonialism or imperialism or racist viewpoint. But the point here is that we are talking about the issue of LGBTQ movement and the issue of LGBTQ movement. We are not saying we will focus the LGBTQ movement in a local area by fully English. There is not the case in our side of the house. Right? We are doing this kind of movement by not using this kind of English fully, but using local. Of course, we use local language to enlighten them. But the only point which we are opposing here is that idea of LGBTQ light itself should be established in a new way in this kind of local area, simply because the idea in the local area itself, is already contaminated, is already painted by their own historical memory. They say imperialism or colonialism is going to be deeply associated with. But we think there's not totally the case. There's not totally the case. Because as I publicly refuted in his speech, if there is a case, these kind of people will refuse to listen to the Western music or to wear the Western clothes or this kind of thing. If these kind of people are totally refusing the idea of the Western itself, so I think there is a totally unrealistic contextualization. No, thank you. But from the very beginning, what are the reasonable consequences we have to have? If from the very beginning, these kind of people cannot refuse totally the idea of the Western idea of this kind of thing. And they might be antipathy. No, thank you. Western idea of this kind of thing. But at the end of the day, because first, they are not fully associated, the idea of the LGBTQ movement is not fully contingent on the imperialism or colonialistic viewpoint. They are totally, comparatively be able to accept the idea of this kind of thing. But the point we have to recognize here, and the comparative which we have to recognize here, is the discrimination which deeply contingent on the history of discrimination in this society. And at the end of the day, because one of the viewpoint, because the viewpoint of the sexual minority in these local areas, they are discriminated. We think there is the most vulnerable actor, there is the most central actor which we have to recognize here. In our side of the house, these kind of people cannot escape from these kind of localized languages in their side of the house. But in our side of the house, because we establish new ideas, and these kind of people can attach their new ideology, new memory, and new fight memory to this kind of new LGBTQ world or Western world, and they can establish new identity. And this is the point which engage towards the engagement issue coming from their side of the house. They say in their side of the house, much easier to engage the LGBTQ movement simply because this more movement it's going to be localized. Yes, that is true. We are more than happy to localize this movement in a way, not using their local language, but catering to demands of these global people. But the point here is that by doing it in our self-help, people can engage it even in our self-help. Because the main logic for zero self-help is that people can access it simply because they have experiences or past memories. But in our self they can do it. We can attach new memories to this new words, and they can accept and they can engage this notion. At the end of the day, because this kind of challenging situation is not something we can avoid. When we talk about the challenging ideas or LGBTQ movement, we have to cater to purity of messages or quality of it. Therefore, we have a lot of it.